We were all buzzing that morning, the kind of excitement only a school trip could bring. It was one of those chilly days where the ground glistened with frost and you could see your breath when you exhaled. The teachers were herding us into groups like sheep, checking names off clipboards as we piled onto the buses. It wasn't often that our small-town school could afford trips like this, so even though it was just some rural education centre, we couldn't wait to be out of the classroom. The ride took about an hour. I remember the fields blurring past the windows, the endless stretches of green and brown dotted with the occasional farmhouse or broken-down tractor. We finally pulled up to this old brick building with faded white shutters. The place looked more like an abandoned inn than an educational facility. A small wooden sign out front read, "Meadowfield Learning Centre." It didn't seem like much, but we weren't there for the building. Behind it stretched acres of woodland and a scattering of old barns and sheds. The teachers handed out lanyards with our names on them and paired us off into groups of 5. Mine was the same group I always seemed to get stuck with: Tommy, Rachel, Aisha, and Liam. We weren't exactly close friends, but we got along well enough. We spent the morning doing nature trails, collecting leaves, and listening to some guide drone on about local wildlife. It wasn't anything special, but it beat sitting in maths class. The afternoon was different. They split us into smaller groups and sent us off in different directions. Ours was assigned to something called the Old Grain Store Challenge. The guide said it was a team-building exercise. We had to navigate our way to an old barn where we'd find a series of clues leading us back to the main building. The teachers didn't come with us. They stayed behind, probably enjoying a rare moment of peace and quiet. We followed the path for what felt like ages, winding through the woods. The trees were bare, their branches stretched out against the grey sky like spindly fingers. It got colder as we walked, and the air had this dampness that clung to your skin. The barn finally came into view, a hulking shape with peeling paint and a roof that sagged in the middle. There was a wooden plaque on the door with the word "Enter" carved into it. Inside, the place was dark and smelled faintly of mold. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life when Tommy pulled a chain. The guide wasn't lying about the clues. There were envelopes scattered around, each one leading us to another part of the barn. It was supposed to be fun, but something about the place made it hard to relax. It was too quiet, like the kind of quiet that presses in around you. Rachel was the first to notice that Aisha was missing. We'd been so focused on one of the clues that none of us realized she wasn't standing with us anymore. We called her name, but there was no response. Tommy said she must have wandered off, but where? The barn wasn't that big. We searched every corner, even outside, but there was no sign of her. The teachers weren't at the meeting spot when we made it back. There was just another guide, a woman who didn't seem to recognize any of us. She asked how the challenge went, and we told her Aisha was missing. She didn't look concerned. She said she'd radio someone to check the barn, but we should head back to the buses. Rachel protested, but the woman's expression didn't change. She just waved us toward the path leading to the main building. When we got there, everything felt off. It wasn't just Aisha. 2 other kids from different groups were gone too. Their friends were in a panic, asking everyone if they'd seen them. The teachers brushed it off, saying the students must have gone back to the buses early. But when we reached the buses, they weren't there either. The drive back to school was quiet. None of the teachers addressed what had happened, and the kids who tried to bring it up were met with sharp looks. Rachel kept staring out the window, her face pale and tense. Tommy wouldn't stop biting his nails. The whole thing felt wrong, but no one knew what to say. When we arrived back at school, the missing students' parents were waiting. Their faces went from concerned to panicked as the teachers told them their kids hadn't been on the trip. They acted confused, insisting their children had been dropped off that morning, but the teachers were firm. They said the attendance sheets didn't show their names and the kids must have skipped school. The next day, the head teacher made an announcement saying the trip had gone well and everyone had learned a lot. No one mentioned the missing students. Their names weren't called during register and their desks were empty, but no one talked about it. It was like they'd never existed. I still have my lanyard from that day. There's a faded stamp on the back, one I didn't notice until recently. It's a small circular mark with the words "Property of Meadowfield" around the edges. I don't know what it means and I don't think I want to. The day of the field trip felt like a free pass to do anything but study, a break from these stuffy classrooms and the constant thrum of lessons droning on. We were going to the Cormac Industrial Facility, a name I'd only ever seen stamped on the sides of delivery lorries rumbling through town. It was one of those places you didn't think about until someone mentioned it. Then it was just there, looming on the edge of things. We piled into the coach early in the morning, laughing and groaning about the cold. The teachers seemed as eager as us to get through the day, their smiles strained in that way they were during school trips. It was supposed to be educational. Real-world applications of engineering, they'd called it. Most of us didn't care. It was a chance to muck about for a few hours and maybe get out of some homework. The facility itself was massive, the kind of place that seemed to stretch out in every direction, all metal and smoke and endless winding pipes. They gave us hard hats when we arrived, bright yellow ones that felt flimsy in my hands. I couldn't help but notice how much heavier the workers' helmets looked in comparison. They handed out laminated visitor passes and herded us into groups. The guide was a man whose name I don't remember. He had a clipped way of speaking, like he'd done this routine so many times it barely registered. He led us through the facility, pointing out the machinery, the furnaces, the conveyor belts, churning endlessly. Everything smelled faintly of oil and burnt metal. The air had this dry, sharp quality that made me want to clear my throat every few seconds. We stopped at an observation deck overlooking the main production floor. The guide explained the process, though I wasn't really listening. My eyes drifted to the workers below, moving like clockwork between machines that hissed and roared. I remember thinking how loud it must be down there, even with the ear protection they wore. The alarms started just as we were being shuffled to the next station. It wasn't the kind of alarm you'd expect. No blaring sirens or flashing lights. Just a series of sharp, shrill notes that cut through the air, repeating over and over. The guide froze mid-sentence. A second later, a man in a high-vis vest appeared at the end of the corridor, waving frantically. The guide's face went pale. He told us to stay put while he spoke to the man. The teachers were trying to keep us calm, telling us it was probably just a drill. Some of the kids started joking about it, making siren noises under their breath, but my stomach was twisting into knots. The guide came back, his face set in a way that made the joking stop. He told us there'd been an issue with one of the systems and that we needed to move to another area for our safety. We followed him down a narrow walkway that snaked above the production floor. Below, workers were running in every direction. I caught sight of one man shouting at another, gesturing toward a massive pipe that was shaking violently. We were led into a storage area filled with rows of metal shelves stacked with spare parts and tools. The guide and the teachers huddled in the corner, whispering. They kept glancing toward the door, their expressions growing more strained. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but every now and then the guide would gesture toward the walls as if pointing out exits. Then there was a sound, deep and metallic, like something under immense strain. The ground shuddered beneath us, and a low rumble filled the air. Dust rained down from the ceiling. One of the kids screamed, and suddenly everyone was moving, pushing toward the door. The guide shouted for us to stay together, but panic had already set in. We spilled out into the corridor, the walls vibrating with each tremor. I could hear the machinery on the production floor grinding to a halt, the rhythmic clanking replaced by groans and crashes. We were funneled toward an emergency exit, but when we reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The guide swore under his breath, fumbling with a keycard. The scanner beeped red, and he tried again. Behind us, the corridor was filling with smoke, curling in from somewhere we couldn't see. The teachers were shouting at him to hurry, but the guide kept shaking his head, muttering something about the locks being on a timer. One of the kids started coughing, the sound harsh and ragged. Someone shouted that we needed to go back, but the guide insisted it was too dangerous. He led us down another corridor, this one narrower and darker, the overhead lights flickering. The smoke was thicker here, stinging my eyes and clawing at my throat. I clutched the hard hat to my chest, my palms slick with sweat. The corridor opened into a room filled with more machinery, massive hulking shapes that hummed and clicked. The guide ushered us inside, saying we'd be safe there until the alarm stopped. He was trying to sound calm, but his voice was tight, like he didn't believe his own words. We waited, huddled together as the room grew hotter and the smoke seeped through the gaps in the door. The machines around us groaned, their movements stuttering. I kept glancing at the teachers, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but their faces were drawn and pale. Then there was a noise, louder than anything we'd heard yet. It came from somewhere deep within the facility, a metallic screech that made my stomach flip. The lights flickered again, and for a moment everything plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the guide was gone. The door he'd locked behind us was ajar, the smoke spilling in thicker now. No one moved for a moment, as if we were all hoping he'd come back. But he didn't. We had no choice but to leave the room, covering our mouths with our shirts as we stepped into the smoke-filled corridor. The air was stifling, every breath like swallowing sand. The rumbling from the machinery had stopped, replaced by the sound of dripping water and faint, distant crashes. We stumbled through the facility, trying to retrace our steps. Every turn seemed to lead us somewhere unfamiliar. Rooms filled with machinery, empty offices, corridors that dead-ended into piles of rubble. The smoke was everywhere now, thick and choking. I don't know how long we wandered before we found an exit. It was a fire door, the glass cracked but intact. We pushed through it, spilling out into the open air. The night sky was a dull orange, the glow of fires burning somewhere in the distance. The air outside was thick with ash, and the smell of burning plastic clung to everything. We turned to look back at the facility, but the building was lost in the smoke. Somewhere in the chaos, the teachers had vanished. It was just us now, standing in the shadow of the facility as the alarms blared in the distance. The regional track meet was held on a cloudy Saturday in late autumn, the sort of day where the air smelled damp and the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or clear up. I remember the energy at the field that day, everyone keyed up and eager to prove themselves. Our school's team had been on a winning streak, thanks mostly to Ellie Harper. She was fast, faster than anyone in the county. Everyone said she was bound for nationals, maybe even beyond that. She was the one we all crowded around after the races, slapping her on the back or trying to squeeze into photos with her holding the trophy. It was the same that day. Ellie ran the anchor leg in the relay, blew past the competition, and crossed the line a full 3 seconds ahead of the next team. It wasn't just a win, it was domination. The coaches were grinning like kids in a sweet shop, and even the other school's athletes seemed resigned to it. Ellie was untouchable. The team took the bus back that evening, crammed into seats with our bags and gear, the trophy glinting on the seat beside Ellie. We all laughed and replayed the race in our heads, talking about how amazing it felt to leave the other teams in the dust. Ellie was quiet, though, which wasn't like her. She usually basked in the attention, but that night she sat by the window staring out at the dark countryside as it whipped past. By the time the bus pulled into the school car park, the air had turned colder. Most of the team scattered quickly, eager to get home and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Ellie stayed behind with Coach, saying she needed to grab something from the equipment shed. I didn't think much of it at the time. She'd probably forgotten a water bottle or something. I waved as I got into my dad's car and she gave a small nod. That was the last time I saw her. When Monday rolled around, Ellie wasn't at school. It didn't seem strange at first. People get sick or sometimes they just need a day off. But by Tuesday, people were asking questions. By Wednesday, the rumours started. Someone said they saw her at the shopping centre on Sunday, but no one could confirm it. Another person claimed she'd run away, though no one could figure out why. She had everything going for her. Scholarships lined up, a family who supported her, a coach who practically worshipped her. The police got involved by Thursday. They talked to the team, the teachers, her family, anyone who might know something. No one had seen or heard from her. The equipment shed was checked and found empty. No sign of struggle, no clues, just nothing. That weekend, I came back to school to grab something I'd forgotten in my locker. The place was dead quiet, the corridors echoing in a way that made my skin crawl. As I passed by the trophy cabinet, I noticed something strange. The relay trophy from the regional meet was gone. The gap where it should have been stood out like a missing tooth. I figured it had been taken for engraving or something. It made sense. They always put the winning team's names on the trophies before they were permanently displayed. But then I noticed something else. A photo of Ellie holding her medal, pinned up on the notice board just a few days before, was gone as well. On Monday, it was all anyone could talk about. People whispered about the missing trophies and photos, connecting them to Ellie's disappearance. The team was told not to speculate, but it was impossible not to. Tommy, one of the sprinters, swore the cabinet had been locked all weekend. Rachel, the long jumper, claimed she'd seen a photo of Ellie in the locker room on Friday that wasn't there now. Over the next week, more things vanished. A framed certificate from the gymnasium wall, a poster from the coach's office, even the nameplate above Ellie's locker. It wasn't just her recent achievements, it was everything. Her old medals, team photos from years ago, even candid snapshots taken by friends. It was like she was being erased. The police questioned the team again, though none of us had answers. The school tightened security, locking doors earlier and installing cameras in the halls, but the disappearances kept happening. On the day before winter break, someone noticed Ellie's name had been scratched off the winner's board in the gym. The letters were gouged out so deeply they'd torn into the wood beneath. By January, her absence was almost like a taboo. No one wanted to talk about her anymore, as though mentioning her name might make the next thing disappear. I walked past the trophy cabinet one morning and realized it looked smaller. The space once packed with awards and memorabilia seemed half empty now. The final straw came during a pep rally in February. The team was being honored for making it to nationals, though we all knew we wouldn't win without Ellie. The coach got up to say a few words, but as he spoke, I noticed something behind him. The banner hanging above the stage, the one that listed every school record, was missing Ellie's name. Her times were still there, but they weren't attributed to anyone, just blank spaces where her name should have been. After that, people stopped asking questions. The team went to nationals and lost spectacularly. The trophy cabinet was locked permanently and no one bothered to refill it. Ellie's parents moved away that summer. Their house sat empty for months before someone new moved in. Every now and then, I think about the last time I saw her, sitting by the bus window with the trophy beside her. I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, hidden in the dark along with the photos and medals and certificates. But most of all, I wonder if Ellie's still out there too, waiting to come back for whatever's left. It began innocently enough. I was struggling with a statistics course that everyone said was a nightmare, so I started going to office hours for extra help. Professor Aldridge was known for being tough but fair, and his reputation made him seem like the safest option for someone like me just trying to scrape by. His office was tucked in the oldest part of the maths building, where the walls were yellowed with age and the radiator made odd noises when it kicked on. At first, he seemed normal, patient, with a dry sense of humor that helped make the sessions bearable. He had a way of breaking down the material that made things click, and I actually started to feel like I could pass the class. After a few weeks, though, the tone of our sessions began to shift. He started asking personal questions, how I was settling into uni, whether I was close with my family, what I did on weekends. They weren't anything outrageous, but they didn't seem relevant to statistics either. I answered because it felt awkward not to, but I left his office with this strange feeling I couldn't quite shake. The questions got more specific. He asked where I lived, whether I was in halls or renting privately. He mentioned seeing me on campus a few times and asked if I liked walking a particular route to class. That made me pause. I couldn't remember seeing him outside the maths building. His expression stayed neutral, though, like he hadn't just said something strange. So I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. I decided to skip the next session. A few days later, I found an email from him in my inbox. He said he'd noticed I hadn't come to office hours and wanted to make sure I wasn't falling behind. It was phrased kindly, but something about it made my skin crawl. I replied, saying I'd been busy with other classes and would come in if I needed help. I didn't go. The following week, I was studying late in the library. The place was nearly empty, the kind of quiet where even turning a page feels too loud. I was buried in my textbook when I became aware of someone nearby. I glanced up, and there he was, sitting at a table a few rows away, just far enough that it didn't seem unnatural, but close enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen him. He wasn't working, just sitting there with a book closed in front of him. I packed up my things and left. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the street was empty apart from the faint glow of streetlights. My flat was only a short walk from campus, and I locked the door behind me as soon as I got inside. The next morning, there was a note slipped under my door. It wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting from the notes he'd made on my assignments. It said he hoped I was okay and reminded me of his office hours. My stomach twisted. I hadn't told him where I lived. I started taking different routes to class, avoiding the library and staying away from the maths building altogether. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that he wasn't doing anything wrong, but the notes kept coming, always left in places he shouldn't have been able to access. Tucked into my locker, under my flat door, even folded into my course notebook. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the bedside table. There was a text from an unknown number. It said, "I saw your light on. Are you okay?" My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the message. I hadn't given him my number. I blocked the number and spent the rest of the night jumping at every creak and groan of the building. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but determined to report him. I went to the department head and told them everything. They listened, nodding in all the right places, but their response was polite and non-committal. They said they'd look into it, but assured me that Professor Aldridge had been with the university for decades and was a respected member of the faculty. After that, things got worse. I started noticing him everywhere. Outside the campus cafe, across the road from my flat, even on the train when I went to visit my parents. He never approached me, just stood there, his gaze fixed on me like he was waiting for something. I stopped leaving the house unless I absolutely had to, but even that didn't help. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the bathroom window. It was quick, just a flash of something pale against the dark, but it was enough to send me scrambling to check the locks on all the doors and windows. The last time I saw him was 2 nights ago. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I noticed a faint glow coming from my desk. My laptop was open, even though I was sure I'd closed it. The screen showed an email draft addressed to me, but the words weren't mine. It was a string of sentences, disjointed and rambling, like someone had been typing while struggling to focus. The draft was blank when I checked it later. The feeling of being observed hasn't gone away, even though I haven't seen him since. I wasn't the best student when I started university, but by the second year I'd gotten into a rhythm. I wasn't a genius, but I worked hard. I kept my head down, went to my lectures and turned in my coursework on time. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just consistent effort. That's why it felt strange when Dr. Everett, one of the senior lecturers in my department, began paying me special attention. At first it was just little things. A comment here, a compliment there, always in front of the others. He'd make a point of praising my essays or using my answers as examples during seminars. I figured he was just the sort of academic who liked encouraging students. Plenty of lecturers had their favorites. But as the weeks went by, it began to feel like something more. He started staying behind after class to talk to me. He'd ask about my plans for the future, whether I was considering postgraduate study, whether I'd thought about which field I wanted to specialize in. I'd answer as politely as I could, trying to keep it casual, but he always seemed to want more. It wasn't just professional interest, it felt like he was sizing me up somehow, trying to figure me out. One day, I found an envelope in my pigeonhole in the department building. Inside was a copy of an academic paper he'd written, with a note attached saying he thought I'd find it useful. I thought it was strange. None of my other lecturers had ever done anything like that, but I took it as a compliment. He must have thought I was worth investing in. Then the emails began. They weren't inappropriate exactly, but there were a lot of them. Suggestions for reading, follow-ups to discussions we'd had in class, and recommendations for lectures outside of the university. He started suggesting one-on-one meetings to discuss my future. I agreed to a few, but the tone of them always left me uneasy. He'd steer the conversation towards personal topics, asking questions about my childhood, my family, even my relationships. He always had a reason for why it was relevant to my studies, but it felt invasive. Dr. Everett was respected in the department. Everyone knew him and everyone seemed to like him. If I went to anyone with my concerns, they'd probably think I was being ungrateful or melodramatic. So I ignored it, hoping it would stop on its own. It didn't. The first time I realized how serious it was, I was in the library. It was late and the place was mostly empty. I was sitting in one of the carrels on the 3rd floor when I felt it, a sense that I wasn't alone. When I turned, Dr. Everett was standing at the end of the aisle, half hidden behind a shelf of books. He didn't move, just stood there like he'd been there for a while. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to act normal, packing up my things and leaving as quickly as I could. From that point on, it was like he was everywhere. I'd see him across the courtyard or in the cafe, always looking in my direction. I started avoiding the library altogether and stopped staying late on campus. But it didn't help. He'd find ways to contact me, emails, handwritten notes slipped under my door, even small gifts left in my locker. A book he thought I'd like, a pen he said he'd noticed me using in class and thought I might want another. The turning point came when I found a photograph in my post. It was a picture of me, taken from behind as I walked through the park near campus. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph. I sat on the floor of my flat, staring at it, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I went to the university administration the next day. I told them everything, brought the emails and the photograph as evidence. They assured me they'd look into it, but nothing seemed to come of it. Dr. Everett still showed up to class, still smiled at me as if nothing was wrong. If anything, his attention seemed to intensify after that. I started keeping my phone with me at all times, checking the locks on my windows and doors before I went to bed. Every noise outside made me jump. I stopped going out with friends, stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. My world shrank until it felt like all that existed was me and him. The last thing he left me was a journal. It was left on my doorstep in a plain brown envelope, my name written neatly on the front. Inside, the pages were filled with his handwriting, notes about me, observations from class, even comments about my habits and routines. He knew when I went to the gym, which cafe I liked, what time I left for lectures. There were sketches too, crude pencil drawings of me in the library, in the park, in my flat. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my parents. I took the journal with me, but I haven't been able to bring myself to open it again. Every so often I think I see him on a train, in a crowd, in the corner of my vision. I don't know if it's really him or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I can't shake the feeling that wherever I go, he'll always be there, just out of sight. I had always thought of myself as a regular bloke, not someone who stood out too much, just a solid, middle-of-the-road kind of guy. University felt like a chance to stretch out a bit, maybe try things I wouldn't have considered back home. That's how I ended up at the house on Grantham Lane, standing in the damp October air with 6 other lads, all of us trying to look like we weren't freezing. The fraternity had a reputation for being the stepping stone to greatness. They didn't say it outright, but everyone knew their members went on to cushy jobs, impressive careers, and all the perks that came with them. I wasn't one to buy into that sort of thing usually, but it was hard to ignore the stories. When they invited me to pledge, I thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? The hazing started small. We were blindfolded and led around campus, forced to carry stupid objects while upperclassmen barked insults at us. It was humiliating, sure, but nothing worse than what I'd seen in films. They called it building character. We called it a bit much. The real initiation, they said, was coming at the end of the week. They didn't tell us where we were going, only that we should wear black and bring a torch. They picked us up in an old van, the sort with rust curling around the wheel arches. The 7 of us crammed in the back, while the members sat up front, laughing among themselves. No one spoke, but there was this charged silence in the air. I remember the way my knees kept bumping into the bloke next to me as the van jolted down the uneven roads. They drove us out past the outskirts of town to where the trees closed in on either side of the road. It felt like we were heading somewhere forgotten. The van stopped, and they herded us out into the forest. The ground was soft and damp, the kind of soil that sticks to your shoes. They handed us blindfolds again, saying we'd know what to do when the time came. I remember the smell of the trees, the faint tang of mold and rotting leaves. The blindfold was scratchy against my face, and the world shrank down to the crunch of my boots and the sound of someone breathing too loudly a few steps away. They led us deeper, the distance from the road stretching longer than it should have. When they told us to stop and take the blindfolds off, we were standing in a clearing. There was a fire already burning, the flames spitting and popping as the logs collapsed in on themselves. Around it stood the upperclassmen, their faces half lit in the flickering light. They didn't look like they'd been laughing anymore. One of them stepped forward and handed me a knife. I turned it over in my hands, not sure what I was meant to do with it. The others were given knives too, and then one of the upperclassmen brought out a wooden box. He placed it near the fire and opened it, revealing a writhing, tangled mass of snakes. My stomach clenched, and I thought, surely not, surely this wasn't what they had in mind. The upperclassmen pointed to the snakes and then to us. One by one we were to reach in and kill one. They called it a test of courage. My hands were shaking as I stepped forward, the knife slick in my grip. I can still feel the way the scales moved under my fingers when I grabbed the first one I could. The whole thing felt like it went on forever, but when it was done, the clearing was silent apart from the crackle of the fire. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought we'd proven ourselves, and they'd let us go back to the van and pretend none of it had happened. But then they brought out the masks. Plain white masks with empty eye holes and long slits where the mouth should have been. We were told to put them on and follow the members deeper into the forest. The masks made it hard to see, but I could make out the outlines of trees and the faint glow of torches bobbing in front of me. They led us to another clearing, smaller this time, with a mound in the center. The air felt colder here, and the firelight didn't seem to reach as far. One of the upperclassmen began to dig, the sound of the spade biting into the earth loud against the silence. When he stopped, they motioned for us to come closer. There was something buried there. It looked like an old chest, the kind you'd find in your nan's attic, only this one was caked in mud and wrapped in thick chains. They dragged it out of the hole, and one of them knelt to unlock it. Inside were more masks, but these were different. They looked aged, cracked in places and stained with something dark. They handed them out to us one by one. When I held mine, I noticed it was damp. The texture was strange, almost sticky. They didn't tell us to put them on, but the upperclassmen stood watching, waiting. One of the lads hesitated, and they grabbed him, forcing the mask onto his face. His body jerked like he'd been shocked, and then he went still. I didn't want to wear it, but the others were doing it now, sliding the masks on with trembling hands. I looked down at mine, at the dark stains on the inside. I turned it over and froze when I realized the dark patches were moving, tiny, squirming things embedded in the material. Before I could react, someone shoved me forward, and the mask was pressed to my face. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Something scratched against my skin, tiny legs skittering across my cheeks. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. The edges seemed to seal against my skin, and my vision blurred. I could feel something pushing against my mind, a pressure building that wasn't coming from inside me. When I woke up, I was back in the van. The masks were gone, but my skin still felt raw where it had touched me. None of us spoke as they drove us back to campus. I tried to piece together what had happened, but every time I thought about it, my head throbbed. I didn't go to the next meeting. I stayed in my room, locking the door and ignoring the knocks that came late that night. The other lads stopped coming to lectures one by one. I don't know where they went, and I haven't seen them since. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch a glimpse of something white out of the corner of my eye, a shape that looks like a face, but isn't. It was autumn when Alex arrived at our school, the leaves in the trees just starting to turn. He was part of an exchange program, something the school had started to broaden our horizons, according to the head teacher. He was tall and lanky, with a shock of dark hair and a sharp accent that made everything he said sound more interesting than it was. People liked him straight away. He had a knack for fitting in without trying too hard, something I'd never mastered. Alex joined my year group, and it wasn't long before he became the center of attention. He had a way of making everyone feel like they mattered. Teachers praised him in class for being bright and polite, and the students liked him for being effortlessly cool. Even the usual troublemakers seemed to respect him, which was strange considering they didn't respect anyone else, not even themselves. He stayed with the Kings, a quiet couple who lived in the old brick house near the edge of town. Their house was neat but plain, the sort of place you'd forget the moment you walked past it. They didn't have any kids of their own, so I suppose taking in an exchange student was their way of adding some life to the place. Alex's popularity grew fast. By the second month, he was everywhere. He was in the yearbook club and the football team. He started tutoring younger students who needed help. There was even a rumor he'd been asked to give a speech at the end of term assembly. It felt like he'd always been part of our lives, even though we knew he hadn't. Then, one Monday in November, Alex wasn't at school. At first, no one thought much of it. People get sick, after all, but by the end of the week, his absence started to feel strange. He wasn't answering texts, and no one had seen him around town. The Kings didn't seem to be at home either. Their curtains stayed drawn, and no lights came on at night. The following Monday, the head teacher held an assembly. She made some announcements about upcoming events and told us to focus on our studies, but she didn't mention Alex. When someone brought him up later in class, the teacher just stared at them blankly like they'd mentioned a stranger. By lunchtime, whispers were spreading. Some kids swore they'd seen his desk removed from the classroom, though others argued it had never been there to begin with. That afternoon, I decided to walk by the King's house. It was a long shot, but I thought maybe I'd see Alex or at least find out what was going on. The house looked different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The windows were clean, the flower beds were tidy, but there was something about it that didn't feel right. I stood across the street for a while, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door, but I never did. Eventually, I walked away. By the next week, things had escalated. Alex's name disappeared from the football team's roster and his picture vanished from the yearbook proofs. The head teacher denied ever organizing an exchange program, and when a few of us pressed her on it, she got angry and said we should stop spreading nonsense. Even the Kings denied hosting him. They told the parents who asked that they'd never signed up for anything like that and didn't know what anyone was talking about. The more we tried to hold on to Alex, the more the school seemed to erase him. A photo of him in the cafeteria mural was painted over. A flyer advertising his tutoring sessions was taken down from the bulletin board. The trophy cabinet, which had displayed a football Alex had signed after a winning game, was suddenly missing that ball altogether. I went back to the King's house one more time in December, just before the holidays. Snow was falling, and everything looked quiet. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The curtains were still drawn and the mailbox was empty. As I turned to leave, I glanced down at the front step and noticed a faint mark on the stone, as though something had been scraped away. When I leaned closer, I realized it was a name, Alex's name. It had been etched there and then scratched out, though not well enough to hide it completely. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. What would I have said? By the time school resumed in January, no one was talking about Alex anymore. Even his closest friends acted like he'd never existed. His absence had settled over us like a fog, something unspoken but always there. Sometimes I think about the things he left behind, the mark on the step, the gap in the team photo, the faint impression of his name on a now blank flyer. They feel like echoes, traces of someone who was here but somehow wasn't. And every now and then I wonder if I'll wake up one day and find those echoes gone too. I remember when I started to notice things weren't adding up. It wasn't a single moment or event that tipped me off, more like a string of small discoveries that made the ground beneath my feet feel less steady. Looking back, I wish I'd ignored it all, kept my head down and carried on. Ignorance might not always be bliss, but it's definitely safer. I was in my last year of school and everything seemed to be going my way. My grades were stellar, teachers gave me those approving nods, and the university offers were beginning to roll in. My parents were proud in that quiet, understated way they had. We weren't the kind of family to gush, but I knew they were pleased, and that was enough for me. I'd worked hard for all of it, or so I thought. It started with a mistake in a test. Nothing major, just a small calculation error in a maths exam. I noticed it while reviewing my paper at home, but my grade was still a perfect score. I remember frowning at the page, wondering how the marker had missed it. Mistakes happen, I thought, and shrugged it off. But then it happened again and again. A mislabeled axis in a physics graph, a literary analysis that was honestly half-formed. Each time the grade stayed pristine. It wasn't just that I wasn't losing marks, it was how polished and untouchable the results felt. Like the grades existed independently of my work. At first I told myself I was overthinking it, paranoia bred from too much pressure and too little sleep, but I couldn't stop noticing. The way Mr. Haynes, my English teacher, seemed to take extra care when handing back my essays, always with a faint smirk that made my skin crawl. The hushed conversations between my parents that fell silent when I walked into the room. The way my peers started giving me looks that felt colder than they used to. I stayed late after school one day, ostensibly to study in the library, but mostly to dig around. I didn't even know what I was looking for. It was stupid, really, sneaking into the staff room when I heard the last teacher leave. My heart was racing and my palms were damp as I rifled through piles of papers. I almost gave up before I found it. A file with my name on it. The file was unnervingly thick. I flipped through it, my breath catching as I skimmed the contents. Copies of my tests, my essays, even some of my homework. But what made my stomach drop were the notes scrawled in the margins, none of them in my handwriting, corrections, suggestions, even outright answers. Someone had gone through my work and polished it before the grades were finalized. I couldn't shake the sick feeling in my stomach as I walked home that evening. My mind raced with questions, each more troubling than the last. Who had done this? Why? And why me? My thoughts turned to Mr. Haynes and that smug little smile of his. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place and he was at the center of it. I confronted my parents about it. They didn't deny it. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes and my mom just kept wringing her hands. They said it was all for me, to give me the future I deserved. I felt betrayed, but more than that, I felt trapped. How could I go to university knowing my achievements weren't really mine? How could I trust anything or anyone again? I thought about confronting Mr. Haynes directly, but the idea terrified me. He wasn't a big man, not physically imposing, but there was something about him that always made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew things about people, things he could use if he wanted to. He was clever in a way that felt dangerous. I started avoiding him, which was hard since I had him for English 3 times a week. I stopped raising my hand in class, hoping he'd leave me alone, but it only seemed to make him more interested. He began calling on me even when I didn't volunteer, his gaze lingering just a little too long. I could feel his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. Then the notes started, slips of paper shoved into my locker or tucked into my textbooks. The handwriting was small and precise, just like the notes in my file. They didn't say much, just little reminders of what he'd done for me and what he could take away. One of them simply read, "We all make sacrifices." I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. My once bright future felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I started skipping school, staying home and pretending to be sick. My parents didn't press me, probably thinking I was just overwhelmed, but I could feel it looming over me, a shadow that grew darker and more suffocating with each passing day. The last note I found wasn't in my locker or my books, it was on my pillow. I don't know how it got there, and I don't want to know. All it said was, "You owe me." I never went back to school after that. I don't know what happened to Mr. Haynes or my file. Sometimes I think about burning the notes, but I can't bring myself to touch them. They sit in a shoebox under my bed, a reminder of a life I'll never get back. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear footsteps in the hall outside my room, but when I get up to check, there's never anyone there.